Hello, this is Ross Bliley from the podcast Pigskin Tales. This podcast is sponsored by Sterling Soap Company. With products sold throughout 41 locations around the globe, Sterling Soap Company has a unique assortment of products to choose from for your loved one for the holidays. Handmade artisan soaps created by Roderick and Amanda Lovin since 2012, these products are affordable and provide great value. Act now and save on your shipping costs. If you purchase $75 or more, your shipping cost is free in the United States. Shop now online at sterlingsoap.com.
What's up, sports history fan? Dana Augusta here of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Ever wish you can get behind-the-scenes access to the Hockey Hall of Fame and dive into the untold stories that shaped the game? Then you need to check out Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories Part 2 by Eric Zweig. Eric's latest book is packed with wild, unexpected tales from epic rivalries and game-changing moments to quirky incidents like polo injuries and snowblower mishaps. Eric Zweig's impeccable research and passion for the sport of hockey will whisk you through the NHL's early years, the origins of the Three Stars tradition, and how hockey first hit the airwaves. Plus, you get fresh takes on legends like Wayne Gretzky, Bobby Hall, and Joe Sakic. Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories 2 is available now wherever you get your books. Grab your copy and get ready to dive deep into the heart of the game.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
With a new basketball season upon us, what better time than now to take a step back in history and discuss the long-lost career of the first African-American to play professional basketball, the first African-American to own a professional basketball team, the first in so many categories. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we take a look back at the groundbreaking career of a basketball icon, Bucky Lew.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 143, Bucky Lew. Now, this is a basketball figure who I am quite sure almost everyone out there has never heard of. And that's because long before there was an NBA, professional basketball looked markedly different. There were many regional leagues spread out across the country, particularly in the Northeast. But one thing most, if not all of the leagues had in common was this: all of the players were white. There were no colored players in any of the leagues, well, with one exception, the NEBL, the New England Basketball League. And that's where Bucky Lew played. He started out for the team out of Lowell, Massachusetts. Now, this was during the early 1900s. And as you might expect, Bucky faced his fair share of racism. Some of it was extraordinarily brutal. But he had the support of his team, and that's what made all of the difference in the world for Bucky and allowed him to continue. The game itself on the court was also quite different than what we watch today. There were no out of bounds. There were no backboards. The ball was very oddly shaped, and that made it almost impossible to dribble. In certain instances, there were unlimited fouls. It was a different game. And joining me on today's show to discuss it all with us is Chris Boucher, who is an expert of sorts on the topic of Bucky Lew. In fact, Chris is now working on a second book about Bucky. His first, the original Bucky Lew, is a fascinating look back at Bucky's career, and I highly recommend it. Now, before we get into today's show, a few quick reminders. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Follow on Facebook. And if you want to watch, check out the Sports Forgotten Heroes channel on YouTube, where you can watch every show I've created since the start of 2024. You can see more stats, photos of the Forgotten Heroes we discuss, and so much more. And please, hey, hit that subscribe button too. And don't forget, wherever it is you are listening, you can also hit the subscribe button, follow, like, and if you can, give Sports Forgotten Heroes a nice review and a 5-star rating. As always, I thank you for your support. Okay, it's time to get into today's show about Bucky Lew, the first African-American professional basketball player, with my guest, Chris Boucher. Chris, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So happy you can join.
Thanks, Warren. Appreciate you having me. Appreciate your interest.
Absolutely. It's certainly an interesting topic, and let's start here. You write about the game of basketball long before there was an NBA. Basketball at the turn of the century. That's the turn of the 20th century. And you do so by talking about the career of Harry Bucky Lew. Tell us about the game from back then. How was it played? I mean, there were no backboards. The court was fenced in, so there was basically no out of bounds. I don't think you could foul out of the game. Free throws were handled differently. Tell us a little bit about the game from way back when.
Sure, I can do that. So there were a number of differences. Similar to baseball, it was the dead ball era of basketball too. So scoring was a lot lower, and the equipment was one of the primary reasons why. So the basketball was a little bit larger than the basketball of today. The design wasn't as good, wasn't quite as tight. Players of the day described it as a lumpy pumpkin. So they actually had laces in the ball, similar to a football. So when they went to put air in it, they would unlace the ball, put the air in it, relace it. And so it was also always a little lopsided because of that. So that made it difficult to kind of dribble, shoot, handle. So that was one factor that held down the scoring. There were a couple others as well. One was, as you said, there was no out of bounds. So the ball was always live. The courts were a lot shorter. It was more difficult for someone to free themselves for an open shot. You also mentioned free throws. So in Bucky Lew's day, when he played pro in the New England day, which was a major league, recognized major league of its day, they didn't have free throws. They thought it slowed the game down. So what they did was every third time your team was fouled, you got a point. So that really kind of held down the scoring and it held down the individual scoring as well. I mean, if you think about it, even in today's game, players don't like to give up layups, right? So you foul someone, instead of giving them an easy two, instead they'd get two free throws. Well, in those days, you'd basically be giving up on average a third of a point for every layup that you prevented. So you got to understand that the players were super motivated not to allow any layups whatsoever. So I guess the last point to that was the people that were running leagues, the owners, the promoters, actually thought offense was a bad thing. They didn't think the fans wanted to see that. They thought the games, which were only scoring in their 20s in those days, were too high scoring. So they did things to keep the scoring down. For example, the free throw thing. Also, they reduced the rims one year to 14 inches. So they're only about 2 inches larger than the balls. So there were a number of things that they did to kind of hold the scoring down. It was definitely much more a defensive game. And as we said at the beginning, due to the equipment, you could consider it the dead ball era of basketball too.
What was the professional game like back then? How was it organized? It's not like there was, or at least I don't think, there was one governing body and one league. There were multiple leagues spread out throughout the country, I would think. What was the game like back then?
Yeah, so you're correct. There wasn't one single league with one single governing entity. So instead you had regional leagues. So Bucky Lew played in the New England League. There were also state leagues like the New York State League. There was a national league. However, even though it was called the National League, it was really kind of the Philadelphia area. It was Philadelphia and some New Jersey teams as well. So the leagues were regional, basically based on the transportation of the day. They were using train to get around. There was no possibility for quicker travel. So the leagues of those days were mostly regional. And each league had its own different rules. For example, Bucky Lew's league didn't have free throws. The National League, which actually went belly up during the later stages of Lew's New England League career, and that resulted in a lot more talent coming that way, was more offensive minded. So they did have free throws. They called more fouls. It was considered more of an open game. So there was more passing, less emphasis on defense, and more scoring. So with these different regional leagues, you also had different rules and really culture as well that these different leagues observe.
Here's a quote from your book. Basketball, in short, combines all the exciting elements of boxing, wrestling, football, murder, and a house on fire. Explain that to us. What does that mean?
Yeah, so that was a quote from a sports reporter of the day after witnessing his first basketball game. So Bucky Lew turned pro in 1902. The game's only 11 years old, still hasn't had a lot of exposure. This reporter witnesses his first game and he describes it in that way. And I think a lot of what he is trying to get across is how physical the game was, what a defensive mindset most of the players had, and kind of how rowdy it was. You had both rowdy players and rowdy fans. You had mentioned that a chicken wire fence surrounding a court, so that separated the court from the fans, kept the ball in play, but it also prevented players from running into the fans and causing trouble there, or vice versa. Unfortunately, the fence still had holes in it, so some fans were able to stick their cigars or cigarettes or pins through and attempt to make contact with the players. But that was kind of the culture of basketball. It was almost like 80s hockey. It was very physical, even beyond physical. They did have a 5 foul per player limit, so players could foul out, but it was very rarely enforced. So oftentimes teams would only have one sub, and maybe not even that. So if someone ruled off, then they were playing shorthanded or playing 4-on-4. The managers, the people running teams, didn't think the fans wanted to see that. Another factor was, as we have today, who wants to see the star player get fouled out? The fans don't want to see that. So they would let let those things go. So for example, one game, Bucky Lew had 10 fouls. One of his opponents over the course of one and a third game I had read had like 19 fouls. So they let the players play with their fouls. And obviously, if someone going in knows they're not going to foul out, they're going to attempt a lot more stuff, especially when, as we mentioned earlier, there isn't much of a penalty. Like I said, you're giving away a third of a point every time you foul someone, not a significant penalty.
So, yeah, I would imagine that strategy was significantly different back then, too. Okay, who was Bucky Lew, and why is he, in your mind, such an important figure in basketball history, especially since he played well before anyone ever thought of an NBA?
Yeah, so Bucky Lew is basketball's first black professional. So he signed his first pro contract way back in 1902. That said, he stayed in the game another 25 years, and he further integrated every role in the pro game. So he wanted to become a coach, general manager, referee, and even franchise owner. And he also coached college too. So really has a stunning list of accomplishments. He basically single-handedly integrated the game a generation before the NBA. So when Lew had finished up his career, the color line had been reduced anyway. I wouldn't say there was widespread integrated basketball, but there were a number of players here and there who were playing. So in the 19-teens, there were a couple of Jewish players playing with black players in New York. There was another black player playing in an otherwise all-white team in upper New York State. So there were white teams and black teams playing each other. So Lew contributed to that. And sad to say, when the NBA did start so many years later, they rebuilt that color wall. So Lew retired in 26? 20 years after that, when the NBA says they started, they traced their roots back to the BAA. They rebuilt that wall. There were no black players in the NBA until 1950. So there's several years there where integrated basketball at that level did not exist.
Chris, we're all sports historians. We love the history of the game. And sometimes we look for unique stories that we can tell, that we can explore, that we can research and learn more about. Where exactly does your interest in Bucky Lew come from, and how did you even hear about him? And then, why write a book?
Okay. So yeah, great question. So basically, we're from the same neighborhood. So Bucky Lew got his start in Lowell's Pawtucketville neighborhood. So my grandfather came down from Quebec.
Lowell, Massachusetts.
Lowell, Massachusetts, yes. So my grandfather came down from Quebec to Lowell, Massachusetts in the 1920s. That's when Lew was kind of putting the finishing touches on his impressive career. That said, I didn't know about Bucky Lew at the time. I actually read a book about early basketball by an author called Douglas Stark, which made it obvious that early basketball is really an ethnic game. There was kind of the dominant teams, you had a Jewish team, Irish team, a couple of black teams that were kind of the best of their day. So I thought it'd be interesting to look into my own kind of family's neighborhood and see if there was a French-Canadian team playing way back in Lowell back in those days. And when I looked into it, I found out that there was, which was really neat. But more interesting than that was that this was the team that had signed basketball's first black professional, that being Bucky Lew. And since I hadn't heard of him prior, even though I had been in Lowell most of my life, had been a basketball fan most of my life, started to dig into him a little further and really didn't find a lot about him. There are mentions of him in various places, but he's really treated as more of a footnote than anything else. So as I read as much as I could, learned more about it, I realized that he had not been the subject of any full-length treatment. And so I set out to do that, set it out to write that book.
When we think of sports and we think of the first African Americans to cross the colored line and play in their respective sports, guys like Jackie Robinson, Fritz Pollard, Duke Slater, and then later in the NFL and the AAFC, the four players who crossed the line in the late 40s. In golf, Calvin Peete was subject to much racism in the National Hockey League. You had Willie O'Ree. How was it? What was racism like back in the day of Bucky Lew? I'm sure it wasn't good, but I'm curious to know what kind of racism he faced, maybe in comparison to the type of racism guys like a Jackie Robinson faced.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So Lew was fortunate in the sense that in Lowell, where he grew up, the schools were integrated. He learned to play basketball at the YMCA, which was integrated. So that was unusual at that time because most of the country observed kind of the Jim Crow black code laws where you had facilities that were separate and unequal, and that was just kind of the way things went. So Lew was fortunate that where he grew up, that was not the case. That said, when he went pro, he was exposed to a lot more than just kind of the local fans who he had grown up with, and he did encounter a series of indignities that he had to deal with. Later in life, he did compare himself to Jackie Robinson and say that he did get especially rough treatment because he was the first, because he was breaking that barrier, and not everyone was happy about that. But just a few kind of specific examples of things that he had to face. So sometimes crowds tried to shout him off the floor. Once his team was set to play a team featuring the best player in basketball at that time, that player led a boycott against Lew's team because they didn't want to see him on the court.
Yeah, that was Harry Huff. I think you wrote about him.
Absolutely.
Tell us about that. Tell us about that as you're continuing your story here.
Yeah, sure. And just two more quick points, and I can get to
Sure.
that. So one night Lou was denied lodging, so he had to play at a game in Vermont and wanted to stay overnight, and he was not able to. So he had to walk 10 miles down the road to the next town to find a place where he would stay. So he was in Charlestown, New Hampshire, had to walk 10 miles in the middle of a freezing January night to find a place that he could stay because he was denied both lodging and then the ability to stay at the train station. So really kind of astounding and amazing and sad. I guess the positive aspect of that might be that the team he was traveling with, which was also the team that he had just defeated, stayed with him that whole time. So he certainly had a lot of adversity to face. And then from time to time, he would have some allies as well. But definitely the biggest, headline maker of those kind of indignities, those issues that he had to deal with was the time Harry Huff led his team in a boycott of Bucky Lew. So Harry Huff was basically the best offensive player of that era. So we were just talking about how low scores were at that time. Harry Huff was a guy who averaged 15 points a game, where teams were only scoring 30. The first time Huff and Lew matched up was in 1903. Huff only played 2 games in the New England League that year. He was on a Pennsylvania team in the National League for the most part. The first game, which came before he faced Lew, he scored 26 points, which was, again, amazing. The next game he faced Lew, he scored right off the tap, 15 seconds into the game, and then Lew held him to 4 points the rest of the way. So Harry Huff only finished with 6, well below his average, well below the 26 he had gotten the previous game. And Lew basically matched him point for point the rest of the way. So fast forward a couple of years later, Bucky Lew has now moved on to a Haverhill, Massachusetts team. Harry Huff, since the National League had folded, has moved over to the New England League. He's playing for a Natick team. Both of these teams are dominant that year. So most of Lew's teammates are from New York, including Ed Wachter, who was one of the few players of the day who was actually in the Hall of Fame. And that was a teammate of Bucky Lew's, and they were lifelong friends as well. So they are set. The fans are set to see these super teams, this likely championship preview. These teams face off in a showdown, but instead it's a letdown. So Harry Huff and his teammates take the floor, but they're really not engaged in any basketball activities while Lew is out on the court. So the game starts, but they're really standing around not doing anything. The only time Harry Huff and his teammates move is when Ed Wachter and Lew's teammates are throwing the ball at them and they have to dodge it. So the crowd is really upset. So it's actually a home game for Lew. And he is a beloved figure. The fans are anxious to see this matchup, especially since these are the two best teams and probably the best offensive and best defensive players of the day. The fans are very upset. It looks like it's about to get ugly. So Bucky Lew actually asked to sit and sits the remainder of the game so that the game can go on. So that battle, I suppose, Harry Huff wins. Although his team loses, he does not have to face Bucky Lew. However, the folks running the New England League have an emergency meeting immediately following the game. They decide that there will be no color line. They fine Huff and his teammates. They say they'll double the fine if they try it again, and following that would expel them from the league. So again, kind of a situation where there's good news, bad news. So obviously that was a terrible incident that Lew had to go through. You wonder why he sat. I wonder if it was to prevent a riot, because it sounds like the fans were very unhappy and it could have gotten really ugly. But then on the other hand, he had the support of his teammates and ultimately the support of his league as well.
What about the fans? What kind of crowds did the game attract back then?
So in terms of numbers, they would draw upwards to 2,000, which is about all they could fit. So they didn't really have dedicated basketball arenas in those days. The game's only about 10 to 15 years old. So they'd play in like town halls or opera houses or wherever they could kind of arrange, their basketball court. So Bucky Lew's rookie season, there were really about 2,000 fans when they had top players coming through. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it was about all that they could fit. And the Boston Braves, that year, their home opener only drew 1,600 fans. So it was just a different scale than we're used to today in terms of fan attendance.
And just to put that, just so everybody knows, when you're talking about the Boston Braves, you're talking about the Major League Baseball Boston Braves, who are now obviously the Atlanta Braves. And what you're saying is they only attracted 1,600 fans. Meanwhile, Bucky's basketball team was attracting 2,000 fans. So go figure.
Yeah, so it was impressive. So I can't say that at the time basketball was bigger than baseball, because it certainly wasn't. I think in terms of sports, people were interested in baseball, horse wrestling, I don't know what else, and then maybe basketball at the bottom. But Lew was certainly popular in the places that he played, and the fans did come out to see him.
How did his over the course of his career, he played on several teams, several leagues, barnstorming, all sorts of different things. How did his teammates accept him? Because he was the only African-American on these teams. So how did they feel about playing with him? And did they accept him? I would imagine, yes, they accepted him on the court, but what about off the court?
Yeah, so good question. So he was lifelong friends with a number of the folks that he played with. So, for example, I had mentioned Ed Wachter, who's in the Hall of Fame. They both had extended careers, and beyond playing, they also coached. There are also rumors of them trying to restart a New England-type league in about 1922. I think at that time, Wachter was finishing up his playing career and coaching at Harvard, and that's when Harry Bucky Lew was coaching at UMass Lowell, then Lowell Textile School, and now UMass Lowell, and that's why I'm sporting this evening. So there was another player that he played with during his independent days, whose son actually interviewed in doing the book, which is really insightful and really eye-opening, and they were also lifelong friends. And this is someone who had played pro ball on an independent team with Lew, kind of traveling New England. Later in life, became a high-powered banking executive, but maintained that friendship. During the Depression, Lew had moved from Lowell to Springfield, Massachusetts. But despite that, whenever this individual, Dan O'Connor, was in town, he would go visit him. So there were several close relationships that he had with a number of the players. Overall, I feel like he got along with his teammates fairly well. I mean, at some point, he's building his teams. So certainly he's picking people who are comfortable playing with him. But since he did have that solid start at the YMCA and the early pros, a lot of those folks were lifelong friends. He, in fact, said in an interview that he did late in the 1950s, kind of on the eve of them opening the Basketball Hall of Fame, and the sports writer he was talking to was anticipating Lew getting an invitation to go in. He had mentioned that some of the players that he had played against in his first few games, where he did receive rough treatment, ended up being good friends of his down the line. So certainly he was a person who was willing to keep an open mind, I suppose. He had some negative experiences early on, and apparently he didn't hold those against folks because he was willing to engage with them and establish relationships with them going forward.
What about his family? How did his family accept his foray into professional basketball?
Yeah, so it's so long ago, it's hard to say. So the closest family member that I was able to talk to in researching the book was his granddaughter. So this is someone that knew him into our early teens when he unfortunately passed in 1963 at the age of 79. So don't have a lot of insight there. I do know that his family had a business. It was a dry cleaning shop, and he actually went to work there direct from 8th grade, which is why he didn't play high school or college ball. He actually got a start at the YMCA and then went pro. So I imagine that he had some flexibility, really, because it was a family business and there are other folks to help there as well. So given the length of his career, I think that they were fairly supportive. One very interesting thing that happened to him after he retired, he kind of stepped back. This is after the Depression. I think he retired about 1928. And then his wife, Florence, stepped up. So she became very active outside the house in church-related and social justice and charity organizations. I think she was even president at one point of some United Church Woman, I think it was called, of Massachusetts. So it seemed like she was willing to sacrifice for him so that he could live that dream. And then once he was satisfied with what he had accomplished, to his credit, he was willing to step back and then allow her to step out and do more and pursue the things that she was interested in. So it seems like there was a mutual support network there, where at different times people were willing to, be patient with him, recognizing that, there'd be a payback later.
Yeah, you mentioned the dry cleaning business. I think it really did play an important role throughout his life. It sort of helped keep him grounded while he was playing the game as well. When he wasn't on the court, he was working in his family's dry cleaning business. And then when he moved away from where he grew up, Lowell, he then, started his own business. Unfortunately, the depression, that hurt him, and that actually helped him get back into the game. But let's go back to the hardwood. Who were the teams back then? Where were these teams located? How big was this league? How was that all structured?
Sure. So Bucky Lew got his start in the New England League, like we mentioned. So that was mostly teams in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. However, they are a recognized major league of their time. According to Bill Himmelman, who is a former Basketball Hall of Fame statistician. He also runs the Pro Basketball Encyclopedia. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's a fantastic resource for pre-NBA basketball. And the reason it was a major league is because it attracted players from outside of New England. So I mentioned that Bucky Lew's team in 1904 and 1905, when he was matched up with Harry Huff, was a lot of New Yorkers. Harry Huff was from Pennsylvania. On his team, there are several other players from the Philadelphia and New Jersey areas. So these were kind of the basketball hotspots of the day. And this league was larger really than its geographic footprint, given the fact that it did have fairly solid support from the fans, and the owners wanted to win, so they were willing to pay to import these players, where they'd have to pay more than just their salary. They would have to pay their living expenses as well.
What was the money like back then? How did that work? Were players paid per game? Did they sign contracts? What kind of money was it in relation, I guess, to wages that people in business were making back then? Talk about that if you can.
Sure. So there was a salary cap. So the players did have contracts, and they were paid the astounding sum of $5 per game, which doesn't sound like a lot. I don't know that it is. It roughly compares to about $175.
I'll tell you this. Many years ago, my father told me that when he first went to work, he made $50 a week. And my buddy was with me. My buddy said, well, back then, $50 a week, that must have been, my father interrupted him and said, no matter how you slice it, $50 a week is $50 a week.
There you go. And I'm sure he earned it. And I think Bucky Lew similarly earned every penny. And so they would play a lot of games to kind of maximize their income. So basketball, like it is now, was what? You would play November through March, basically. So there were some players who would be pros for that period of time and not have day jobs. But other than that, you would have to have a day job. Lew did, work at the dry cleaning shop during the season, during the day, although with his travels and practices and similar things and all the time he spent in the gym building up his body. If you see pictures of him from when he started in 1902 to when he won the championship with the Vermont squad in 1907, he must have gained 30 pounds of muscle. So besides playing basketball and working on his game in the gym, he was also spending a lot of time building up his body as well so he could withstand the physicality of the game. So in terms of finances, there was a salary cap, $5. It was kind of a wink, wink salary cap. It was well known that owners were willing to pay outside players more to come in. Then you had someone like Harry Huff, who was constantly jumping cities, jumping teams, always asking for more. So there was some money to be made. Wasn't the same as baseball necessarily, but even in those days, I don't think baseball was a year-round sport necessarily. When it was winter, they would have to go travel and play somewhere else. So there was some money in it, but it was not a career as we would think of today.
Talk about Bucky's game. What kind of player was he? What were his strengths? What were his weaknesses?
Sure. So Bucky's nickname, and the nickname I used in the title of my book, was the original Bucky Lew. So he was known for his original stunts in dribbling and passing. He was also one of the top defenders, if not the top defender, in whatever league he happened to be on, and he always played the opposing team's best player. He was not much of an offensive player. He said he could shoot from outside fairly well, but had trouble closer to the hoop, probably because of his small size. He was about 5'7", 150 when he started. And I think he probably found it difficult in those crowded situations to get off a clean shot. He only averaged 3 points a game, which to the modern basketball player probably sounds ridiculously low. But if you consider that the first team he played on that first year in 1902, that team averaged 20 points a game. And as far as the individual's kind of contribution to that, it was half of that, because half of the points were just given to the team based on fouls. Again, without free throws, there was one less chance he had to earn points. So if you multiply his career average of 3 points a game times 5, because that's how you would kind of make it somewhat similar to today's game, where they're scoring 5 times as many points as a team, 100 points, Penny's in like the mid-teens, maybe give him a little bump because he didn't get any free throws either. Now he's a respectable offensive player to go along with his outstanding defensive abilities.
Game strategy. We talked about how the court was set up and fouls, and there's no out of bounds. We talked about all that earlier. What about strategy? Can you talk at all about strategy, how teams played the game?
Yeah, so it was certainly a lot more pass-oriented than today's game, and there was no shot clock, so teams were willing to be patient and work the ball to try to get that open shot. Now, in those days, the dominant shot was kind of a set shot that you would release from about your waist area. So you can imagine in those crowded conditions, it was difficult. You really had to work for the space to get that shot off. So it was a lot more ball control, passing oriented, being disciplined about your shots, a lot more of a defensive approach too. So Bucky especially played almost like a safety position. So he would have been like the back guard. So this would be almost like someone today hanging around near the top of the 3-point line, but much farther than that, because his primary job was to stop the other team from scoring easily. They wanted them to have to work the ball down the court slowly and not be able to kind of like push it ahead.
He worked the ball down the court, though. Was it all through passing? It wasn't easy to dribble. How did they manage to work the ball down the court?
Yeah, so they would use a combination of passing and dribbling. As we discussed, the ball was a lumpy pumpkin, so it was difficult to handle. So you could double dribble in those days. You 2 hands on the ball, release it, pick it back up. It was a more physical game, so if a defender happened to be near you, you could bowl them over. So that was another technique that people would use as well. And also passing. So Ed Wachter was also credited with coming up with the bounce pass. That was one of Lew's early teammates. So that Haverhill kind of super team that he was on near the end of his New England League career was known for their passing, particularly like bounce passing, and then attempting to fast break. So the game was evolving. Not surprising given how new it was and people were still figuring out how to play. But largely it was a much slower paced game. Teams were moving the ball through their double dribbling or their passing, and really making an effort to get someone open to take an open shot rather than just getting the ball up on the rim. You had mentioned earlier there was no backboard, so you weren't getting any help, especially when you have a basketball that's moving through the air like a knuckleball would. There's no backboard to help you that you can use to bank it in off of. So they were really looking for a clean look and for the ball to go straight through the hoop.
Here's a funny question for you. What was the role of the official, the referee, and how many were there at a game?
So there'd be one at a game, and I think their primary role was not themselves to get hurt. So there was a jump ball after every score in those days, and the referee had to be very careful when he threw the ball up not to be crunched in between the two players going for the ball, which sometimes would happen intentionally to send a message. So the referee was looking for what they could see. Again, there's only one out there. They can only see so much. They are calling fouls. There's a lot more that they're not seeing. From what I read, many of the players of the day were actually more concerned about the crowd reaction to their play than the referee. So I know in one of the early books, Cages to Jump Shots, there's some early quotes from some early players saying he really tried to play as dirty as he possibly could without riling the crowd up too much. Because even though he's protected by a fence, objects might come over the fence, and he still had to leave the court at the end of the day. So the referee was there and kind of doing their best, I think, to maintain order. But they were up against it. They had a difficult job, and oftentimes they were overruled by the managers. For example, if they didn't want a player with 5 fouls to leave the game, they also oftentimes had to require on police assistance to break up fights, of which there were many on the court in those days as well.
What about the teams that Bucky played on? How competitive were they? I didn't read in your book about too many championships won. They did win games, but were they a first division team, a second division team? How would you classify that? How were the teams that Bucky played on?
Yeah, so his teams were always competitive. I mean, when he was at the YMCA, of which one of the teams, his last team, he was a captain. He won several championships. His initial role, Massachusetts team in the New England Basketball League, was finished second place, just out of first place in the first half of the first part of that initial season. If they had taken first place, they would have gone on to the finals. The team where he played with Ed Wachter, matched up with Harry Huff the last couple of years in the New England League, was one of the best teams in the league. And in fact, in Lew's last year in the league before it folded in 1905, he really narrowly missed, I think, 2 championships. So as you might imagine, since I had described the Haverhill and Hague teams as the 2 best teams in the New England League in 1905, they matched up in the finals. However, unfortunately, they played one game and they took a week-long break because Harry Huff's team was going to play an exhibition series against another team. Now, one of the injuries that Lew suffered throughout his career was a chronic dislocated shoulder. This is something that he initially did at the end of his second season. And then in this championship run-up, he actually hurt it 3 times. Basically, it hadn't healed. He'd have it dislocated. He'd take a couple weeks off and he'd be back in the game. So after game 1, after this break for exhibition games, Bucky Lew's teammates who are from New York, they want to play some games as well while they're here to make some money while they're here. In that game, Bucky Lew dislocates a shoulder. So heading into game 2 of the series, he's injured. So he sits out the next 3 games. He plays in the final 2, but only about half of it. Natick, Huff's team, ends up winning the New England League Finals in 1905, 4-2. But then it gets even worse, and this is another, I think, miss of Bucky Lew's. So Ed Wachter, who I had mentioned, now goes back home, takes some of his teammates, and goes on a Midwestern tour. They end up beating the team that beat the team that won that Winter Trials in 1904. And so they have the right to call themselves the world's champions. And I do suspect that if Lew wasn't hurt, if he was able to play, he may have gotten both that New England League Championship and that World Championship that same year. But he was really unable to go. It wasn't even an option. One recent newspaper account I had read a few days after the finals ended said that basically his shoulder wouldn't stay in place. And he had just had too many injuries that hadn't healed in too short of a time, and he needed an extended break. So those were really 2 near misses where he might have really added a lot to his resume, you might say. He did get a championship a couple years later in 1907. So that was a state championship in Vermont. And then, of course, he played independent for 25 years. Lowell, Massachusetts had a lot of city championships, and he certainly took many of those.
moving back off the court, what kind of person was Bucky? You paint a pretty good picture of him in your book. I mean, I took that he's respectable, he's reasonable, family oriented. Tell us about Bucky Lew, the person.
Sure. So I think that those are all true. So he was known as a gentleman on and off the court. He had a reputation as a clean and skillful player. He was one of the few players in the day who, despite the regular fisticuffs that happened on the court, that never threw a punch in a game. So he had that same demeanor on the court and in his regular life as well. So his granddaughter had described him as a very quiet man, didn't talk a lot really about his experiences unless he was prompted. So he was kind of a gentleman, quiet, kind of dignified, and that's the way he handled himself, both on the court and then in everyday life as well.
What about his own family? When I mean that, his mom and dad, we sort of touched upon that there's a family-owned dry cleaning business that he went back to. But what about his family? And you mentioned Florence earlier, and they had we'll call it a unique wedding. He loved family. However, when you go back to his family, it wasn't exactly very smooth going for him. And I'm not talking about racism. From the time he married Florence, tell us about the wedding and his children. It wasn't easy.
No, it certainly wasn't easy. So he was married in December of 1906, shortly after dislocating his shoulder in a game, once again, in an independent game. And his wife was really ill. So it seemed that they were planning their wedding. They had picked out a date. She was really ill. At some point, the doctors weren't sure that she was going to make it. She did rally and seemed to be in good shape, so decided to keep the date. And they were actually married in the hospital on that December 19th. December 12th, 12/12. They probably kept that date because it was a cool date. So that was, the unique circumstances of his wedding. Following that, a few years later, they started to have a family. He had a daughter who died of scarlet fever, I think at about age 5 or 6. So very sad, kind of tragic death. This is one of those things that is not so much an issue for us today, but was a risk in those days. And sad to say, it was one of those issues that was spread perhaps through playmates or through contaminated milk or something like that. So a really tragic death that they had to go through early in their married lives.
Like you just said, ultimately injuries, particularly shoulder injuries, forced Bucky to give up the game. He tried to make it with his own dry cleaning business, but that didn't work, mostly because of the depression, like we mentioned earlier. But then another opportunity came about. Bucky, who was the first professional African-American basketball player, now had a chance to be the first African-American to own a team. How did that opportunity present itself? And tell us about that experience, because it was one that he wasn't going to pursue until Florence told him, "What, are you kidding me?"
Sure. So in 1915, the men who had run the initial New England Basketball League wanted to revive it. So it had been gone about 10 years. It collapsed under kind of financial pressures. As I said, not all the teams were competitive. It was dominated by 2 teams, one of those being Lew's, also, and the owner's kind of outlays for salaries weren't being met across the board. So 1915, those gentlemen get back together. They remember how popular basketball was in Lowell, Massachusetts. They want to revive that franchise. Who else to turn to but Bucky Lew, who was the man in Lowell basketball. So he gets an opportunity to run a team in that league. 1915, certainly an interesting year. So that's the year Birth of a Nation came out. That was the movie that inspired kind of the revival of the Klan. And here at that same time, Bucky Lew is running this team. So he builds that team. He does come out of retirement. So he had broken his leg in New Hampshire the previous winter. but he does agree to lead the team. And then since he's running the team, why not save a few bucks and sign himself? So he comes on as the sixth man. And so he goes through that experience. That league ends up folding in January, sad to say. I'm not sure if it was the run up to World War I or what, but a lot of teams were based in armories and seemed to be losing their facilities. But he still had that invitation to play and had that experience of running the team, having that honor as being, as being recognized as the man in little hoops, and having those peers of his that were executives willing to allow him to integrate the game to continue that legacy that he had built.
Yeah, over the course of his final years in professional basketball, he basically barnstormed, played independent games against other teams. Was that a sad time that there was no league to play in? What was that like?
Yeah, so that was kind of the state of basketball in those days. So after an initial kind of burst when it first came upon the scene, the popularity kind of leveled off. And at that point, college basketball was bigger than the pro game. It may have been because of the roughness of the pro game that we talked about. So it certainly had some interest in a cult-like following, but had some difficulty kind of getting to that next level and attracting more fans. So the players of that day, once the leagues disbanded, they formed their own independent teams, and then they would kind of travel for games and just play the local folks, whoever the best team was that they could organize. And so what's interesting, as I had mentioned, this is happening during the time of the Klan's revival. Lew mostly played in New England. I haven't seen any record of him playing outside of it, and that may have been due to Jim Crow. But even in New England, you had I saw one estimate of up to 400,000 members of the Klan. And so here is Lew traveling with his team during that era. And further, the players that Lew had drawn his team from, they're from Lowell, like a factory town, mill town type of place. There are a lot of immigrants. So a lot of the teammates that he had were Catholics. They were either Irish or French Canadians. He had a Jewish player. Also, obviously, he's a black man running the team. So basically, everyone on the list that the Klan despises is who Lew has built a team to and is taken to their town. So obviously, he experienced a lot of trauma and difficulty in that way, but he stuck with it. One interesting fact is 2 of the players that played with him were policemen. So he had a fellow from Nashua, Jim Mulvanity, an Irishman, and then Pat Lynch from Lowell, Massachusetts, were both policemen. So it seemed like he built a team that had some players on it that were accustomed to, that had some skills in kind of putting people in their place and getting crowds to settle down. But despite that, clearly there were a number of, negative experiences that he had to kind of battle through, but he wanted to keep it up. He wanted to keep playing. He wanted to continue to live that dream. And he did. I mean, he played until 1926. So he played until he was 42 years old. So unbelievably, incredibly lengthy career playing for 25 years, especially considering the basketball, the style of game that was played in those days, as well as the racial climate.
He was the first African-American professional basketball player, the first African-American to own a professional basketball team. He coached on all different levels. He officiated. What didn't he do?
So I haven't found that yet. So it's a long list. You just went through it. So as far as I can tell, he integrated every conceivable role in pro basketball, and some of them all at once. So there was a blurb. I think I mentioned this in a book. I'm not sure. I may not have, but there was a blurb that I had read in a paper saying that a game had to be rescheduled because on that same night, Bucky Lew was scheduled to both play, coach, and referee. So he did it all, and sometimes all of it on the same night too.
This is a tough one. At least as a pioneer, and actually I'm somewhat surprised by this, that he is not in the Basketball Hall of Fame. He is not in the Pro Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts, which, by the way, is where he lived. Why is that? Has there ever been a campaign to get him in there? Does he deserve, should he be in the Pro Basketball Hall of Fame? And how many others from his era are actually in there?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question. So to me, it's obvious that he does belong in the hall. I mean, we've talked about his incredible list of accomplishments these past 30 minutes or so, right? So the fact that he is basketball's first Black professional and the Hall of Fame does recognize that. They have sent a letter to the family attesting to that fact. They have had temporary exhibits at the Hall of Fame on Bucky Lew and similar players. So they do recognize that. I don't know how much they know about the full 25-year career, to be honest. Like I said, my book is the first full-length treatment that he's gotten. So I'm not sure that a lot of stuff is known or at least well-known. And it's not like you can get the people who make these decisions at the hall, get to them because it's a secret voting group or whatever. Their identity is a secret, which is probably a good thing because you don't want them being harassed too much. But it's not like you can sit down and have a conversation with them. One, not to make excuses, but the only thing I can think of, one of the few reasons why he might not be in the Hall of Fame is not a lot is known about early basketball. I mean, to a lot of basketball fans, basketball started with the NBA, and that was me a few years ago. So I knew that Naismith had invented the game in 1891, and then the next thing I knew about basketball was the start of the NBA 50 years later. And I never even thought about what happened in between. Obviously, a lot had happened in between. So I think that's part of it too. Like for whatever reason, there's a lot more interest in early baseball, in early football, and not so much in early basketball. Part of it might be the low scores, although I think that the game is probably a lot more similar to today's game than people think. But just at a high level, when you just see scores where it's 15-13, a basketball fan, a modern basketball fan, might conclude that the quality of that game was not very high, not understanding the circumstances that led to it. A big part of it being, the basketball itself. So as far as previous pushes to get Lew into the Hall of Fame, so the family did try back in the 1990s and was not successful. Even more recently, the Hall had a early African American Pioneers Direct Elect Committee, which existed for about 10 years. And they put in about a dozen or so folks, many of the folks who are profiled in Claude Johnson's The Black Fives book, made it. Lew was on the eligible list for consideration, but for whatever reason, he was not elevated from that list onto the Hall. That would have seemed to be his kind of best shot for getting in. So that committee, sad to say, has folded about a year and a half back. So that is no longer an option for Lew. So it seems now it's as difficult as it's ever been for him to get in. Sad to say.
Well, your book, The Original Bucky Lew, Basketball's First Black Professional, is really, it's a fun read. Very interesting. You bring up some great points in there. Some unique writing in here. I enjoyed reading it. Please tell us where people can go and get a copy of your book.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate you reading it.
Oh, it was a fun read.
Yeah. So you can get it wherever you find your book. So obviously there are online retailers where you can find it. It's in the local bookstores in Lowell, Massachusetts. Obviously, if you want it in your bookstore, wherever you happen to be, you can go in and order it. You might have to wait for it. Certainly, I think that's an option if you want to support that bookstore, or you can find it online at the typical places.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I did too. Thank you, Warren. Again, I appreciate your interest. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Anytime. If you want to learn more about Bucky, please pick up a copy of Chris's book, The Original Bucky Lew. And you can also head on over to sportshistorynetwork.com, where Chris has written more about Bucky. That's sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey, thanks again to Chris for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.